but this is a special Monday evening authors event associated with Blackwell's, who are outside, as you may have seen. But if I may take the chance, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Public Lectures programme, you'll find it in this blue card outside. And 2 lectures we have forthcoming, which may be of particular interest to this audience. On the 30th of April, Tuesday, Michael Billington, the former Guardian theatre critic and elsewhere, speaking on the theatre in the public conversation, 60 years of reviewing and broadcasting the stage, which happily is 4 years to the day since it was scheduled, but then COVID intervened, so by chance it's exactly the same day 4 years later, which is rather poetic. And then our last lecture in the programme is on the 16th of May, the Russia-Ukraine War, with Mark Galeotti, a very prominent writer and academic on the subject of Ukraine. My housekeeping matters. Could you ensure your phones are in a silent way, please, as Miles Davis would say? Not expecting a fire alarm, so if an alarm does sound, please join us in the car park. You'll be guided out through the exit here and an exit here. And if you'd like to tweet about this event, Insights NCL has been promoting it, so you'll be part of the conversation on there. Right, it's wonderful to have with me this evening Alice Loxton, who, no less than Dan Snow said, trying to make you blush, the next big thing in history. From the last big thing in history, that's quite an achievement. And I hadn't realised you actually have your own bookmark, which is the sign of arriving in any measure, which you can also acquire outside. And our guest writes the sorts of books that people actually want to read. And I hadn't realised quite the extent to which she's engaged mainstream audiences on television, online, National Gallery, Sotheby's, National Portrait Gallery, BBC, National Trust, and also demonstrating, this made me realise my age more than I wanted it to. I'm reading this like it's a foreign language. Wicked, History Hit, Call of Duty, Minecraft, Xbox. What are these, and how did you get involved with this?
Yeah, so I've just done lots of collabs with lots of different organisations, like Xbox in some cases, like Minecraft, and I suppose it's a reflection of how lots of these organisations are trying to tap into the history world, and also the history world's trying to tap into things which are very relevant. So the Minecraft thing was with the National Trust, and they asked this Minecraft creator.
For those who aren't aware, though, what is Minecraft?
Yeah, so I'm not a Minecraft fan particularly, but it's just, I think it's like an online kind of gaming thing where you can build these worlds. And the National Trust asked the most famous Minecraft creator, this guy who's like 27, he's called Grian, if anyone knows him, and they asked him to recreate Corfe Castle, which is a ruin, and they asked him to recreate it in a way that imagined if it was still in real life. So, that's a very kind of niche thing, but there's lots of things I get asked to do like that all the time, in a very strange way.
Is there a Call of Duty Georgian Britain? Does that happen?
Call of Duty, I can't actually remember quite what that was. But yeah, no, it's all the time I get all sorts of strange requests. People like, say Wicked, that was because they tried. So Wicked, they asked me to make a video about the theatre that Wicked was in, and that was looking at the kind of architecture of Wicked, of that theatre on Shaftesbury Avenue. I do things with the Liverpool museums, Manchester museums, National Portrait Gallery. On Thursday and Friday, I'm filming on the roof of the National Gallery to mark the 200 years since it was created or founded. So yeah, but that's all social media. So there are all these kind of small collaborations and small videos that happen, really.
Speaking of which, you have 1.5 million followers on Instagram, 11.5 million likes on TikTok, and the one I've heard about, Twitter, 25,000. So this requires a great deal of curation, I would think, to have this kind of engagement. Are you constantly publicising what you're doing or reaching out to people?
Yeah, that's it. So the reason it came about is that I was working at History Hit TV, which is a company that was set up by Dan Snow. And Dan Snow set it up, I think, because he had been working with the BBC and doing all the programmes that we know him from. And when you do TV production, there is, you go and film for about a week or 2 weeks, and then you might get a half-an-hour documentary out of it. And I think Dan Snow really felt that there was so much potential to use all that excess content or, overlap and use all these different platforms. So documentaries, whilst you're there, whilst you're in Egypt filming, do a podcast as well, or do some TikToks, or do, all this kind of other content. So I was working there, and that was really exciting. And then I got into this kind of social media way of presenting, And it turns out it's incredibly effective to make these mini documentaries on platforms like Instagram and TikTok, and to really treat it like a proper TV channel. And I think it's a very exciting thing for young people, or people of any age, but people, if you want to start your own channel on Instagram, say, or TikTok, there is nothing stopping you. And in the past, you'd have had to, be commissioned by the BBC or ITV, and that's a very difficult thing to make happen. So at the moment, anybody can create their own channel in whatever they want, as much as they want or as little as they like. So it's a very exciting thing, I think, and it's been very exciting for me. And wonderful that so many people find my content interesting, and all my content is just looking at historic buildings, and there's a real appetite for that out there, which is great.
It also seems a slightly Hobbesian world. Are your interactions overwhelmingly positive with people on social media, or do you tend to avoid looking under the line, as it were?
Well, what I found is that whatever you put out, you get back. So if you put incredibly wholesome content out about a parish church, you get incredibly wholesome comments back. And I basically realized, because obviously social media can be a scary place, that if you just, it's always about the history, it's not really about my personal life. I'm not like an influencer in that way. And people seem very positive. And people come up to me all the time and they just say, I love that video you did about the encaustic tiles of Winchester Cathedral. It's something like that. It's not, so it's it's a nice interaction, really.
You had a full-page, double-page spread in the Express profile a few weeks ago, and they said, quote, your videos are turning Gen Zers onto history. She has found a way to make history captivating for teenagers and 20-somethings, raised on short snippets and instant gratification. The very platform that often gets labelled as a breeding ground for mindless clickbait. So it's possible to make use of it in a positive way, you're demonstrating. Yeah,
so I think it's strange that, people often criticise TikTok and Instagram as this place where young people are just, they're addicted to it, and it's just looking at beauty products or, kind of dances or whatever it is, which is true, but then it's strange that this is the platform where the most amount of eyes are looking, millions and millions of eyes are looking. So why don't people like Mary Beard have a platform there? If we want to communicate, if say Mary Beard, who I think is amazing, not to bring her down, but if someone like Mary Beard wants to communicate to loads and loads of young people, the effective way to do that is not probably to write in the Times, where people have probably already read your book, but to make TikTok videos, and I think it can be an amazing way to communicate, and I'm surprised more politicians, anyone who wants to communicate with a lot of people very quickly, don't use it more. But I understand also it's quite a difficult kind of platform to use. Yes,
but those who do, it's quite cringe, has to be said. Grant chats is worth a look, by the way, if you're interested in politicians or these things.
Yeah.
But do you wonder, as you were speaking there, I just maybe reflect, had you been born 20 years earlier, for example, do you any idea what your medium would have been? Because TikTok is a very recent thing, it's a very unique platform.
Yeah.
How would you have done what you do then?
I don't know. I suppose, so when I was at university, I was at Edinburgh, and I did history. When I was at university, the platforms which I use now, and the job which I have now, didn't exist. And I'm 28, so that was 7 years ago. So that's pretty amazing that, it's completely transformed in that time. And it's exciting for students now, whatever your career might be, even at the age of 28, it might be something that we don't even know what it is yet, it doesn't exist. So what would it have been, if I'd have been 20 years earlier, I suppose I'd probably have gone into the BBC, say, or a company like History Hit, and probably been still working as a producer, in a sense that you have to work your way up in this very kind of, over decades, which is fine, but I think it's something that we've never had before, that people can create these amazing platforms of whatever it is. Maybe you're into pottery, or you're into clothing or fashion, or you're into music or opera, whatever it is. It's amazing that people can create these platforms on their own.
Does it interest you how documentaries have changed over time, from the traditional A.G.P. Taylor looking to camera for half an hour with nothing else to now more interactive things and no narration and so on? Is that sort of interest for you?
Yeah, I think documentaries is really interesting. And they have changed a bit, but I think it is striking how little they've changed. If you look at the show Cunk on Britain, if anyone's seen that, which is a spoof of the history documentary, it it's basically a spoof, and it's this woman who she just talks in this classic way that the historians always talk. There's the shot of the feet, like walking along the cobbles, then the hand on the door. It's just like all these cliches in history documentaries. And the only reason that is so funny and it really resonates with lots of people is because we are so familiar with this format of history documentaries. And I think there could be a lot more that is changed, and they could be thought about in a lot of different ways. But people are changing them. I mean, for me, going into the world of broadcasting, making documentaries doesn't seem like the relevant thing. The thing that seems relevant and the thing that gets to loads of people, millions of people, is through social media or through podcasts or whatever the new TikTok will be in 2 years, which will be something. I don't know what it will be, but it will be something. And yeah, I mean, I'm on documentaries with Channel 5, and it's like I don't even know it's gone out yet or not. It's just it sort of passes you by. But maybe that's a generational thing.
But you've moved into long-form writing. You don't imagine falling into long-form broadcasting. You don't imagine that being an obvious step up for you. Your own documentary series are doing that sort of thing. You seem wedded to the smaller, shorter versions. I
mean, I'd love to do longer documentaries. I don't know. Lots of people I know my age don't own TVs. I just don't think documentaries plays a part in younger people's lives as much as they might have done for older people. But we'll see. We'll see. I mean, it's great. It's a great format as well, and you can obviously get much more into it than in a TikTok. Obviously, TikTok has limitations in many, many, many ways.
Yes, but for those who aren't familiar with it, what's your general pitch? What do you do that makes them so popular? How do you go about, or what do you intend to achieve through 15 seconds, is it, video?
Probably about a minute.
A minute, right.
So in a minute, it will be, I think the strength of it is that they are packed full of information. So the speed at which you have to talk when you're making an Instagram reel or TikTok, which is just the same sort of thing, is you have to speak very, very fast in real life. So if I did it now, you'd think it was very slow down. But actually, when you edit it, it's fine. So when people look at the videos on their phone, people can take in the information very, very quickly. And I think that's part of it, that young people, when they watch documentaries now, it's like very slow. The pace is too slow. So it's fitting in a lot of information very quickly. It's packed full of information, packed full of facts. And also it's not on me, it's just showing the thing that I'm talking about. And that's just an editing thing. So, yeah.
Could you tell us, not the obvious question, but people are very curious to know your course here, your career path. What brought you to this evening, for example? You went to Edinburgh University to do history and so on, but what else did you do between then and now?
So I went to Edinburgh Uni, I did history, which I loved, and then the October after going to Edinburgh, I sent an email to History Hit TV, which was the company Dan Snow set up. It's quite big now, but when I was applying, there was about 4 people there, and I just sent an email, and then I was the intern, and then I started doing the social media, scheduling Dan Snow's tweets sometimes, or editing documentaries or producing documentaries. So I went all around the country producing documentaries with Ray Mears or Dan Cruikshank, all these kind of people, and then presenting as well. And then this time last year, I went freelance. So that's and the way I do, and now I do writing books, lots of social media work, so lots of commission content. So recently I did something for Mary and George, that new drama, the Jacobean drama, which is incredibly risque.
What did you do, maybe ask? What was your role in that?
Oh, so Mary and George, this new drama, it's all about George Villiers and James I. And I just made a video. So they paid me to make a video to say, this is this new thing that's coming out. And then I put it on my channel as an advert. But, so there's lots of things like that all the time. Or at New York last week to go A Gentleman in Moscow, if anyone knows that novel. They've just brought out a drama. So again, went to that to see it and make a video. So some of them are quite loosely linked to history, but I think they're all good. It's all just encouraging people to look at this new TV drama that's kind of loosely based on history. And all the PRs are always really upset when I say I have to say it's inspired by the history and it's not historically accurate. They never like it when you pick up on that, but you sort of have to say that. So yeah, I do social media and books and sometimes do talks and things. So yeah.
What was your 10 Downing Street gig?
So I was at 10 Downing Street every Friday. They have an event where they get young people to come into Downing Street. When I was there, it was like school children, secondary school children. And it was in the summer when the American ambassador was here. And so it was me, Rishi Sunak's wife, and the husband of the American ambassador. And they just had this panel like this. And I was just like asking the questions for 15 minutes. But then when I was there, I was making TikToks as well, which is absolutely unprecedented because they never let people film behind the scenes there. So that was very exciting.
Onto this book, which is extremely widely reviewed, Uproar, Satire, Scandal and Printmakers in Georgian London. Tell us where the idea for this came, what the concept is.
So when I was at Edinburgh, I was studying a lot of Georgian history, just because it was my general interest, and I was struck that these images, so Uproar was all about a set of artists who make some prints, satirical prints, and these prints would be displayed in the print shop windows of places like London or Edinburgh, but this is really about London. And the prints are incredibly lively and exciting and kind of fascinating insights into the period where perhaps, we normally look at, say, George III in terms of his portrait, but actually these prints gave a much kind of more lively insight and lots of little clues that could help you dissect that moment in history. And we were always using these images to be taught about that political event or what was the situation at the time. But I was very familiar with lots of these images, but I realised that we were never really taught about them in terms of the artists. They were always a kind of side note, an addition to the historical events. And then I realised that, so the main artist is a man called James Gilray, and then I realised that I hardly knew who he was, and he had such an important impact. You might recognise the main image on the front of the book. That's the plum pudding in danger, probably the most famous political cartoon ever made. It's been used again and again and again on things like this. Cartoonists today will use it. And I just realised that it was amazing that I, as a fourth year Edinburgh student, didn't know more about this artist, and that also in general people just don't really know who they are. And so I thought, actually, somebody should write that book. And then I thought maybe I should write that book. So then that's how it happened.
And it comes across, your writing style is extremely vivid, colourful. You write, quote, art in a more unhinged, wild, raucous, deliberate manner than ever been seen before. But it does seem to be inaccessible hitherto. Has it been behind a sort of scholarly wall? No one's been able to publicise it, popularise it.
So there's been some amazing books written on Gilray. Tim Clayton is the expert, and I'd never want to kind of question that his work has been amazing, and I could never have written this book without what he's done. But to give you a sense, the book that he's just published, it's an amazing book. It costs, I think, £50. It's like this big. It's like a coffee table book, and it's beautiful. It's like beautifully illustrated, and it's an amazing, amazing book, and very well written. But I just think, if you're not into Gilray already, would you buy that book? Probably not. And I just tried to. I think there's a lot of books that have been written sort of about this era, sort of about this topic, but they're never books that you might sit on a sunbed on holiday and read. And that's kind of that's the gap that fills, I think.
Was that part of the pitch, Gilray for the Sun Lounger?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's a good way to think about it. It's like, would you read this book on holiday? And I think hopefully you would read that. Even just the size. Like, you can't read a coffee table book on holiday.
No.
So, yeah.
And £11.99 rather than £50.
Yeah.
Pass that on for possible later relevance. But it's come out at the same time as Clayton's book and also another book by Joseph Montaigne. There does seem to be suddenly, these three books come out very recently. Is there an anniversary, or is there some reason why there's been this coincidence?
I don't know. It is actually a coincidence. So I went to this event in London about 2 years ago, and it was by St James's Church in Piccadilly. There's this stone that they put in where Gilray was originally buried, and it's just like a memorial stone to Gilray. And it was a hilarious event of like the Gilray fans, which was about 30 people. and George Osborne was there to like announce it, and because he is involved in politics and stuff, so he was like the VIP guest. But it was like a really strange event at lunchtime, and one of the people I was talking to someone there, and they said, "Oh, why are you here?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm writing a book about Gilray." And then Tim Clayton came along and said, "Oh, so am I," which is like very unusual. So then I met him then first. I mean, he's been working on this for years. And so I don't know why particularly he wrote his then, but maybe there is a Gilray Renaissance. I think I've definitely approached it for the first time in a new way, in that I've been talking about James Gilray on TikTok, which has literally never ever been done before. And I think I have tried to bring it out to a new audience. I think also it often gets talked about in a very political way, like this is political history, because it does involve that, but actually. They have this, there are thousands and thousands of these prints, and they cover every aspect of life, every kind of folly and foible of ordinary people. And I try to talk about it in a way that, it's more just like a general history of Georgian Britain through the eyes of these satirists. So maybe that's kind of easier to help people to get in. I just try to make it a good story. That's it, really.
No, you've succeeded. Only I think having politicians makes it rather rarefied, but it does make one realise that satire didn't begin in the 1960s. I mean, there's quite a ferocious attitude towards, a suspicious attitude, cynical attitude towards politicians, even in your period. I mean,
definitely. So the people who made Spitting Image, they said that they owed Gilray a royalty payment. So they are really inspired by this. And yeah, I mean, if you look at any of these images, you'll notice that or if you look at any cartoonist's work today, you'll notice that the style is so similar. So much of the imagery is exactly the same. They kind of reference Gilray all the time.
Martin Rosen does it very much.
Yeah, and they'll say the bottom, you can always see in the bottom corner, they'll say after Gilray or Gilray again, anything like that. And it is incredible that this image is the Plum Pudding in Danger, 1805. It was this moment where it was very tense time. There were, during the Napoleonic Wars, people basically thought that Napoleon might invade. There were troops on the north coast of France waiting to invade. So it was a good reason for people to be nervous. And Gilray creates this image. There's Pitt on the left, who's the British Prime Minister, and then on the right is Napoleon, and you can't see it there because it's cut out, but he's very, very small. So the big legacy of these artists is that they created this myth that Napoleon was short. He wasn't. He was of average height. He probably stood taller than Nelson, and that was a kind of propaganda of that moment. But this image, it shows them carving up the world, or carving up a plum pudding, which is a kind of like a Christmas pudding. But actually, if you look a bit closer, you'll realise that it's representing the globe. And so each slice is the bit which reflects the kind of power of that individual at that point. So Pitt carves up this massive slice, which is the Atlantic Ocean, and that reflects Britain's naval supremacy. And Napoleon has Europe, basically reflecting how he's dominating Europe at that point. And it has this kind of quote at the top which says, "The great globe itself and all which it inherits is too small to satisfy such insatiable appetites." So basically saying that these politicians have insatiable appetites, they're very greedy, isn't Britain enough for you, isn't France enough for you, whatever. And it's been used as an idea for basically two world leaders arguing over something. So recently, they've replaced, modern cartoonists will replace it with modern people like, Donald Trump or the British Prime Ministers or any world leader. And in the middle will be the thing that they're fighting about, say, the COVID vaccine or the COVID virus or something. Or it's like one of them was like, the plum pudding has COVID. And, so they have a lot of fun with it.
And indeed, the book is dedicated for James Gilray.
Yes. That's it,
very
yeah.
Nice, yes. Are there memes, to use a contemporary word? Do they have memes, or are their choice of subjects too vast to reduce to something like that?
What do you mean?
Things that they draw on particular aspects of human behaviour or particular dimensions of public life, or is it too varied for that sort of?
Yeah, I mean, they are like memes. So what's so exciting about them is that they were created and they could be created very quickly. So they could be created immediately. So say, for example, in 1809 there's a big scandal, and it probably lasts a few months or a few weeks, and every day, pretty much, they're creating a new image. And then this image would be created and put in the print shop window, and there'd be crowds of people that would come to the print shop window. It was described as veritable madness. Visitors said that you had to make your way through the crowd with your fists to get to see this new thing. So I think it does reflect that social media hype that we have today, where, there's a political event and everyone suddenly makes memes or they tweet. I mean, think about the Kate Middleton stuff now. That is exactly the same kind of hype and gossip, and you've seen all the images of people have put together of like, where is Kate Middleton? Well, that's exactly the same as what the satirists were doing, and in all of their images, there's like loads of tiny little details that we probably don't pick up on now because they're so niche to that exact day. But yeah, it's the same sort of kind of excitement and thrill, I think.
And you describe him, these are your words, the facility with which he composes subjects and the rapidity with which he etched them astonished those who were eyewitnesses of his powers. This faculty was early developed. He seemed to perform all his operations without an effort. It seems so complicated and seems so detailed, and yet he could be...
Yeah, well, the thing is, there's so many. There are a lot of different types. So some of them are quite complicated and they'd have taken a bit longer, and because you could buy these prints as well. So they were like luxury items, but you could also, some of them were kind of produced a bit quicker and then they'd be put in the window. So it's interesting, it's hard to look at them because in some ways they were these like public displays. They'd be put in the print shop windows, and ordinary people who couldn't even read or write, who didn't, who maybe couldn't even understand the language or anything like that, they could understand them on one level. But then also, some of the prints were made that you'd buy them and you'd take them back to your big country house and you'd have your print room, or you'd have them all in drawers, and then you'd laugh about them and you'd laugh at all the jokes from classical literature or from, from Renaissance art or something. So it's different kind of levels of how you might experience them.
Your three main characters are Gilray, Thomas Rowlandson, and Isaac Cruikshank. How would you distinguish them or differentiate them for the audience?
Yeah, so Gilray's the main one, but there are basically three artists, and they all work in London, and I realised that they are all working between basically Piccadilly, Covent Garden, Soho. They're all in this small area. They're all working for the same print sellers. They're all, selling. They're kind of studying in the same place, and so they obviously knew each other. And so you can sort of think of them as a bit of a set. And I don't think people have really thought about them so explicitly in that way before. Or they're always seen as these like separate entities. But of course they'd have bumped into each other all the time and been inspired by each other's work and everything. So Gilray grew up in London, and then he's in London, as did Thomas Rowlandson, and Isaac Cruikshank grew up in Edinburgh and then came down to London. So and they all. So that's that.
Do they owe much to Hogarth?
So Hogarth is described often as the grandfather of modern political cartoon. So he's like 1740s sort of time. He does the Rake's Progress, the Harlot's Progress, and then Gilray and co are sort of 1790s. So they're the next generation. And there's a lot of references to Hogarth's work in their prints. The thing is that why is Hogarth remembered as a kind of big name and not Gilray? I think it's because Hogarth made paintings, and Hogarth made paintings that hang in the National Gallery today. And it's something about paintings and printmaking that people don't perceive printmaking as like a proper form of art. In that you have a painting, it's one painting, the artist's hand was on that painting, and once you got rid of that painting, it doesn't exist. Whereas with printmaking, obviously there's thousands of prints that exist from one, or hundreds of prints from one metal plate. The print itself is not the artist's work, because the actual artist's work is the metal plate. There's also, they're on bits of paper, so they kind of lost that. Then they're not as beautiful and glossy as an oil painting that has a gold frame and hangs in a National Gallery. So I think, and I've talked at the London Print Fair about this, and all the printmakers there today, printmakers today say that they find the same problem. That people don't really think of prints as an art form in the same way as a painting, or they don't respect it as much. So I think that's one reason why we don't think of the satirists as proper artists. They're always talked about as printmakers, like they're artists. They're proper artists. In the canon in the story of British art, it should be like Gilray should definitely be there. And yet because he didn't make paintings, why is he not in the National Gallery in London? It's so crazy. That is one of the most famous images ever made in Britain, and has shaped the course of history. Because of Gilray, today, probably most people in this room, I don't know, or maybe lots of people in the street, if you ask them, tell me something about Napoleon, one of the first things they'll say is, oh, he was short. Well, that's a complete lie, and that's created by Gilray. And so despite the fact that Napoleon achieved all these amazing things, crowning himself in Notre Dame Cathedral, or whatever it was, despite all of those things, we still perceive Napoleon through the lens of this guy in Piccadilly who's making these prints. And that really shows the impact of his work. So it's quite amazing that people don't know he's not got a bigger platform, really.
It's unfortunate that, speaking of platforms, Sarkozy had platform shoes, Macron's quite short. So there's a tradition, at least, of French presidents being not overly stacked. Was there also an element, do you think, of Victorian prudishness after they died, that they became less fashionable and shunned?
So the Victorians, they decided that they wrote about them wonderfully in some ways, or in very flowery language, as the Victorians tended to do, about how appalling these artists were and how they were, so immoral, and their work was just disgusting and appalling, and they really discouraged Isaac Cruikshank's son, George Cruikshank, who was going to be the second Gilray. They discouraged him from following in the path of making these satirical prints, and instead he went and he illustrated the books of Charles Dickens. So he did all those illustrations. And everyone championed him as the wisest, the most honest man, good George Cruikshank, who could never say anything wrong. And whilst deriding his father's generation. And his father's generation were great drinkers. Isaac Cruikshank died of a drinking competition, but everyone said it was fine because he won the competition. And then, but his son George Cruikshank, who was the Victorian one, he was like a teetotaler, and he campaigned for against drinking, and he made these kind of more wholesome prints, or at least in Charles Dickens' books, it's very moralising, Oliver Twist sort of thing, kind of commentaries on society. And it's not as crude or anything like that. It's more family friendly, if you like. And yet, so we're still kind of, because we don't really know Gilray now, I still feel like we haven't really recovered from that moment. And yet it was so hypocritical, because say George Cruikshank, they championed him as this incredibly honest man, a great kind of household name, and yet when he died, he'd been married to this woman called Eliza. So he'd had this wife who'd been married to him for many years. They'd never had any children, and yet it turned out a few days after he died that one of the maids that had lived with them, Adelaide Atttree, he had been supporting her in a house just around the corner. And once more, with Adelaide Atttree, George Cruikshank had had 11 children. So that is the hypocrisy. People, they were championing George Cruikshank as this really solid figure, and meanwhile deriding his father's generation of these satirists, and yet it was also hypocritical, really.
Cruikshank indeed, yes. Some other great characters you have here: George III,
yes.
William Pitt, Charles James Fox. Which of them appealed to you most as a
Yes, well, this is the great thing about, I do think these artists are incredibly talented. I think Gilray is a genius on the level that you might talk about Michelangelo or someone like that, a unique genius. But I think they were also lucky that they had this amazing Shakespearean cast of characters. So we had King George III, who was, in some ways, he was known as Farmer George. He had these very kind of ordinary interests of farming, and he'd talk about things like turnip yields, and he'd like to have Sunday lunch with his family. Meanwhile, his oldest son, the future King George IV, was described as the most appalling, indulgent, party-going person ever, who was just wasting public money. And then in politics, you had William Pitt, who was the Prime Minister that became Prime Minister at 24, not to make anyone feel insecure about their own career path. But he was this very, very tall, physically, he was very, very tall and skinny and very diligent, and he'd turn up and he made these amazing speeches. But then opposite him was this man, Charles Fox, who was much rounder, physically looked completely different. He had very bushy eyebrows. He was known as the eyebrow. And he would come in and he'd be very sloppy and almost as if he'd come in and make a speech, and it was obvious he'd been drinking the night before and hadn't gone home, was just like it was a bit kind of disgusting in his appearance. But he would come in and he would people would listen to him and he would just entrance the room of people. You know, people were just kind of amazed by him, and he could kind of inspire people in this amazing way. And so they're opposite each other in politics. And then you've got people like the Duchess of Devonshire and people like Napoleon. So this is wonderful set of characters. I think William Pitt's the one that Gilray that's the one on the left, and he's got some great prints. I mean, but even this lady on the front, she's an opera singer, and the way that he depicts her is just so, full of life. That's the way that these people in the past, we often see them through the lens of, say, Reynolds, and he'll depict, so this is the opera singer called Miss Billington, Elizabeth Billington, and Reynolds will depict her as this like goddess who is in these clouds and isn't even singing, and she's just like looking up, and there's little kind of cherubs flying around her. And obviously that's just a complete Photoshop edit, if you like. It's completely filtered, and yet Gilray gave us the real version of people. So that lady on the front, if you see bottom left, she's looking back, she's got her cheeks are all pink, she just looks like a real woman, and it's a kind of much more honest version of what people are like. So yeah, I mean, there's some wonderful characters.
Speaking of women, and my last question before the lights go up and we turn to the audience, you'd make a lot of Hannah Humphrey. About him I didn't know very much, so tell us about Hannah Humphrey.
Yes, well, so this is the big thing. So the famous artists are these men, and they are brilliant, but at the heart of it all is this woman called Hannah Humphrey. And Hannah Humphrey, I mean, there's a lot of print sellers at the moment, but in this book, the one that I focus on is Hannah Humphrey. And she commissions all of Gilray's work, really. And she is this like amazing businesswoman who owns her own print shop, leaves, when she dies, she leaves loads of money behind. She's like very successful. She's at the heart of the operation. So I often think of her as like a Simon Cowell figure. So she's in the middle. She's the one dealing with the business, commissioning things, coming up with the concepts, taking the risks, dealing with the money. And then she's got this talent, which is like the James Gilray character, and that's a bit like a Harry Styles figure, say, or the X Factor starlets, in that they are like the names, but actually Hannah Humphrey is the one that's like orchestrating it all behind the scenes. And so she's like, in some ways, the key core figure. But the problem is that because she's not the talent, people don't really write about her so much. And so she doesn't really kind of feature so much. But if you were making a film about it, if you were making a movie, she would be probably the core character. And so maybe that's an interesting thing about women in history or certain people in history, that because they're not the kind of face of things, that you don't really hear about them. But yeah, she's a cool, and there's a lot of women who are printmakers, print shop owners in London at this point. So that's kind of interesting. Don't really think about that.
Speaking of cinema, do you have thoughts of this going into a long-form TikTok, sort of an hour and a half sort of cinema release?
I have been talking about screenplay, so we'll see. I think the way that's written is very filmic, actually, in the way that maybe the way that I write is just like, I always try and imagine what it'd be like to go in the room, to be there in that space. What would it actually have been like? But yeah, that'd be cool, a screenplay. I think a bit like the Desperate Romantics series, if you remember that, about pre-Raphaelites. That was quite a good drama. Maybe it could be something like that. But yeah, I have actually talked about writing a screenplay. So
you won't share it with us, but I'm sure you've thought about casting as well, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I said I'd like to be Hannah Humphrey, please.
You have the rights, of course. Yes.
To launch my acting career.
Thank you, Alice Loxton.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Thank you so much.